It had been 4 days since your sister was murdered. However, you did not feel that life had progressed at all since then. Time seemed to have stopped when you learned of the news. You were unable to eat, sleep, breathe, for that matter. You were even more sickened that it had happened right under your nose. Could you have stopped it if you had known? If you had been awake? She was only in the next room. If you had slept in her room as she begged you to, would she still be alive? Maybe you could have saved her if you hadn't been so selfish. Maybe it would have been you instead. You almost wished it had been. Reminding yourself you shouldn't think that way, you laced up your shoes. You didn't have any answers. Neither did the police. Not yet. The only thing that made sense to you was to take matters into your own hands. You knew that you wouldn't be able to live with yourself until you found the truth. You needed to find the evil being who so violently took her life. As you stepped outside of the motel room into the cold, misty night air, your mind flooded with the unforgettable image of your sister's lifeless body. Although you couldn't see straight at the time, the details of the forensic report were enough to burn an image into your brain. Scratch marks on right side jawline and left clavicle, complex fracture in upper right rib, bite wounds in jugular region neck, right side, and one other detail you tried not to think about because the explanation for it was quite impossible. Suspected animal fur left in clumps on and around victim's body. When they suggested it had been the result of an animal attack, you shut it down. It couldn't have been. You always kept every door and window tightly shut, locked even. There was no way anything was getting in there, right? You couldn't blame the detectives. It wasn't much to work with. Furthermore, the DNA tests on the fur came back inconclusive. You didn't know if you could possibly figure this out, but you knew you had to try. You made your way to your small apartment near downtown, a place you no longer thought of as home. When you pulled into your reserved parking space, the events of 4 nights ago came flooding back. Well, not fully. Much of it was foggy. The grief counselor attributed your blocking out of the memories to your brain's trauma response. It was simply too much for you to handle. The only clear memory of that night was waking up in a cold sweat to the sound of your sister's dreadful screams before they faded into her last breaths. But you couldn't think about that right now. Focus. You headed up the stairs to your apartment door and stuck the key in the lock. This is it. You hadn't been there since it happened. Taking a deep breath, you turned the key and opened the door. Everything in the kitchen was as you left it, neatly put away in its respective place. Trembling, you made your way down the hall into your bedroom. Nothing out of the normal seemed to jump out at you. Your bed was expectedly unmade, just as you had left it that night. You weren't going to find anything here. What you needed was in that room, her bedroom. You stared at the closed door. You could almost hear her voice echoing as she begged you. "Can you please sleep with me tonight? I'm scared." You chuckled. "You're a big girl now. I think you can sleep by yourself. Plus, I told you to stop reading those scary stories before bedtime. At least try, okay?" Hoping she would agree, you tucked her in for the night. "Okay, fine," she sighed. Little did you know, that was the last time you would ever talk to her. You didn't know why you didn't just accompany her. After your parents died, you had spent a lot of time lying with her in bed until she fell asleep, but since it was no longer as fresh, you decided to encourage her to sleep alone. You just wanted her to learn to be independent. She was 10 years old after all. Only 10 years old, and taken from you. You began to cry, remembering her adorably stubborn personality. Why couldn't you have just made an exception for one night? She would still be alive. But you shouldn't think about that right now. Focus. You turned the knob to your sister's bedroom and pushed open the door. Catching a glimpse of the yellow caution tape, you fell to your knees, sobbing. Your fingers traced the tape outline on the floor of where your sister once lied. How could she be gone so soon? You still couldn't grasp this new reality, a world where she did not exist. Your fingers stopped at a change in the texture of the tape. Something was caught in it. Wiping your tears, you scooted your body closer to the tape, plucking out what was stuck to it. Hair or fur? It was a fragment of the tufts of fur they had found on her body. Examining it in the light, you curiously bring it to your nose and take a large whiff. Memories of that night suddenly overloaded your mind. In an attempt to organize the missing puzzle pieces that had become lost memories, you leaned back against the bed to ponder the series of events. After kissing her goodnight, you closed her door and made your way to your own bedroom. You had a plate of steak and green beans waiting for you on your night table. Your sister had finished hers earlier. It had been forever since you'd eaten meat. You hadn't been able to make anything good with money being so tight. But after your recent promotion, you decided to make your sister's favorite. Time to relax and watch your favorite show, The Bachelor. You sunk your teeth into the steak. Delicious. It wasn't long before you drifted off to sleep. However, you were abruptly awakened by a deep, howling sound. With your heart racing, you jumped up. What the hell was that? You scrambled out of your room to check the apartment and ended your search, and by checking in your sister's room, nothing. You let out a sigh of relief. What a strange and very vivid dream. You had been positive the sound was real and that it had come from almost right next to you. Holding your head in your hands, you sighed, frustrated. That was all you could remember. Maybe if you acted out everything as it happened that night, you would remember more. Even though you had absolutely no appetite whatsoever, you decided to warm up some leftover steak and green beans from the fridge. Carrying the plate of food to your room, you turned on The Bachelor. Maybe this would lead you to the truth. Minutes later, you finished your dinner, yawning. You knew you really should head out soon. This didn't seem to be working. After using the restroom, you sleepily trudged out of the bathroom. But before you got any further, you felt some meat stuck between your teeth. Rolling your eyes, you made your way to the bathroom mirror. But it wasn't long before staring at yourself in the mirror felt all too familiar. And not in a good way. You had a pit in your stomach. Something happened here. Suddenly, you remembered. You had been standing in that exact spot that night. Something had been wrong. You had tried to go back to sleep after the nightmarish howling you heard in your dream that jolted you awake. But you couldn't. You were so itchy. It was completely abnormal for you to itch so much. You rarely ever got rashes or anything like that. But in that moment, specifically, your face and hands were profusely itching. That was not the only thing bothering you. Your stomach was killing you, and the pain was seeming to grow increasingly worse. It must have been bad meat. Hunched over, you walked to the bathroom while holding your stomach. Lifting the lid of the toilet, you hurl what seemed to be the entire contents of your stomach into the toilet. That's the last time you'd be having steak anytime soon. You stood up to get cleaned up at the mirror when you froze. For what was staring back at you in the mirror was not the reflection of a 24-year-old woman, but a creature. A creature with dark, thick fur. With eyes so piercing they seemed to penetrate into your soul as they stared back at you. As you stared, still frozen, at the atrocity that had overtaken your body, it appeared to change. You watched as the fur began to thicken, eyes began to sharpen, and nose began to excruciatingly protrude outward. You screamed at the top of your lungs as your reflection began to resemble more and more that of a wolf's. But your scream was no longer a scream, but a howl. The howl from your dream. What's all the noise about? You heard your sister's voice grow nearer as she approached the bathroom. You attempted to hide, but couldn't think straight. Suddenly, you heard an piercing scream as your sister's eyes fixated on the horror that had become of her sister. She ran away quickly. Without a thought, you tried to run after her, but you stopped yourself. Why did you have a horrible gut feeling that this wouldn't end well? Feeling another sharp pain, you fell to your knees. Looking down, you saw your hands begin to form into large paws with sharp claws. What was happening? All you could think about was food, meat, your sister. All you knew was that you wanted to taste her. Unable to stop yourself, you ravenously raced after her while letting out a deep growl. You fell to the floor, shattering the glass vase that rested on the counter. No, there's no way. What you recalled must have been the nightmare you had that night, but it felt too real. You comforted yourself with the thought anyway, even though you knew better. Your scrambled thoughts were interrupted by a searing pain in your stomach. You cried out, clutching your lower half. You could feel the individual cells in your body moving, changing, morphing into what you suspected was the monster that was to blame. There must have been some other explanation. There had to be. But deep down, you knew the truth. You killed your sister. You used your arms to pull you to your feet and stared in horror at the creature in the mirror. You couldn't believe it was reality. You couldn't believe it had been your fault. How could you do this? How could you forget? How is this pulse? What was that? Your attention was directed to something else. You suddenly caught a whiff of something that appeared to be the best scent you'd ever smelled, and you needed it. Now. Before you knew it, you burst through your apartment door before letting out a loud, deafening howl that echoed throughout the town. You had to catch it. You took off into the mist and disappeared into the night.